Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see so many people here this early, because it was super easy for me to get up, so. But I have my tea. I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. My name is Mer Lafferty, and I'm too close to the mic. And this is What I Read When I Was Young, and you might think that the people on this panel may have one really cool thing in common. So these are all, except for Rebecca Roanhorse, unfortunately, all of the best novel nominees for the Hugo tonight. So let's just... And we've all brought weapons and are prepared to do battle after the...
I am a fencer, fear me.
Never mind, no on the weapons.
I have a fountain pen.
It's mightier than the sword.
So let's start with my left. Why don't you introduce yourselves and tell what awesome book is up for the Hugo tonight?
Hello, my name is Yoon Ha Lee. I am the author of Revenant Gun, and I like writing about genocide.
My name is Becky Chambers. I wrote Record of a Spaceborne Few, and I like writing about nice folks.
My name's Catherine Valenti. I wrote space opera. I like writing about washed-up glam rockers.
I'm Naomi Novik. I wrote Spinning Silver, and I like writing about dragons, none of which appear in that book.
My name is Mary Robinette Kowal. I wrote Calculating Stars, and I like writing about ladies in space.
I was on another panel earlier. We were talking about the novels, and one thing that came up over and over again is how different all of these novels are. And so I'm really looking forward to this panel because I'm curious to see what you guys read when you were young. But let's start with the happy, good, easy question, which is, what was the first book you read where you ended up saying, oh, hell yeah, sci-fi, fantasy?
For me, that was Enchantress to the Stars.
Yes!
By Sylvia Ingdahl. And it was the first one that I recognized was science fiction. I had previously read science fiction, but I hadn't actually realized. I read Wrinkle in Time before that, but I didn't recognize it as science fiction. I was just like, well, of course you go to other places when you do math.
It's too hard for me to say because it was not a choice that I made. I think it was a choice that my parents made. My mother and I have actually been rereading a story together. She reads it to me in Polish, and together we translate it between her sort of trying to articulate what the words are and me dredging up memories from when I was 5 years old, and it's called Baśń o Princesa Parisada I Ptak Bulbulezar, which is about a beautiful sort of princess who doesn't know how to cry. And because her life has been so happy that she never cried, and she never learned how to cry, but she sort of has to go on a quest to learn how to weep before she can win the three wonders in this magical world. So that early, and after that, the one that people would know is The Hobbit was the first English language thing that I remember.
I mean, I remember reading almost exclusively fantasy as a child, but the one that I remember knowing it was fantasy and having to have a conversation about it, I have to preface by saying my mother had no boundaries whatsoever. My parents were very young when they had me and just had no notion of what's appropriate for a child. There's this play called The Breasts of Tiresias, and my mother was in her master's program for drama, and so I grabbed this play off of her stack at 5 years old. And started reading it, and I didn't understand a lot of it. What I really liked was that in the beginning there's a lady in a dress with a monkey print, and she takes balloons out of her bodice and throws them at the audience. That I was really into. But the plot of the play is that the women of Zanzibar decide that they don't want to have children anymore because they want to be astronauts and presidents, and the men of Zanzibar take on the childbearing tasks and immediately become hyper-competitive about it and start having like 47,000 children per man. And I remember like talking to my mother going, but that can't happen, right? Like, he's making it up. And like my mother being like, well, sometimes we write stories that are not, strictly speaking, things that can happen in the real world. And I remember having that conversation with her about this surrealist play by Apollinaire.
I cannot remember science fiction and fantasy not being in my life, but the first book I remember was The Hobbit. My mom read it to me when I was 4 or 5, thereabouts. My memories of it, of course, are fuzzy, although I've read it many a time. But I have this vivid memory of the night she read me the scene where the Black Rider goes by on the road and the hobbits hide under the tree, because she reads that bit and it's like, and now it's bedtime. And I was like, no, it's not. It's not. And I didn't sleep. I remember lying there being so afraid for the hobbits. And I mean, it turned out okay. That's not The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. Excuse me, we read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Sorry, that was my cred just out the window there. But no, but The Lord of the Rings was the one where I was terrified, but also entranced.
I did not come through science fiction by way of my parents, because my parents are Korean and they are not really familiar with the genre. And my mom is not fluent in English, and my dad was pretty much never at home, so they just let me read whatever I wanted. So at the age of 10, one of my friends got into Anne McCaffrey, and I read Dragonflight, and I was blown away by the time travel loop in it. And then there was also something about something dragons, mating flight, something. And it wasn't until 10 years later, returning to the books, that I realized that people were having sex.
I had that experience with Clan of the Cave Bear. I read it at 10. I climbed up onto the piano to take it off the top shelf where my mom had very cleverly placed it, thinking this was an impediment, as opposed to like a big sign saying, read me. And I was shocked to find out that, hey, there's rape in this book. Like, in college, somebody was like, oh, that book had so much rape. And I was like, what? There was something other than like flint napping? And I was, that's...
Yeah. So this is it may be the same answer, so if it is, just move on. But at least for me, when I was a voracious reader, but it wasn't until I hit certain books that made me want to think, oh, I can do this. I want to do this. And I was wondering if you have a book that's not what we just talked about that really inspired you, that this was the path you wanted to tread. I want to start with you.
Actually, I was horse crazy as a small child, and I was into the Black Stallion books by Walter Farley. So I wrote these horrible knockoff stories about horses that ran a race and they made the mile in however many minutes, and the jockey was famous, and the end.
That was better than a lot of stories I wrote when I was a kid.
The Left Hand of Darkness. I went into high school loving sci-fi and fantasy, but I didn't think about it critically. It was just fun. It was just good fun. And I would go through things at the library, all these like wonderfully trashy paperbacks, and I thought of it as kind of fluffy. Like, it was fun. I was in honors English, and like that was all dry and stuffy and serious literature. But I was into this other thing that was just, it was fun and like kind of rebellious, it felt. And then I had a teacher who handed me Left Hand of Darkness and was like, I think you're gonna really like this. And it blew my mind wide open, because here was this like serious book. But it opened my eyes to what the genre was capable of and what it could do. And I was like, oh my God, there's so much potential here. There's so much message here. Like, this is what I want to do. And that's the book that took me from just reading it and enjoying it to being like, to being here.
I think for me it was The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende, ironically. It's an incredibly metafictional story, like more I think than people realize even watching the film. The proper edition, as I think of it, has green and red text, depending on what world you're in. It is an incredible work that the movie doesn't come close to covering. And what I think really drew me into it and started thinking about like the act of writing words is that each chapter begins with this incredible full-page illuminated letter and it's all in the order of the alphabet. And so it's just, for a child of my temperament, was an open door beckoning in, like, look at how cool words can be, with like the stone bicycle peeking out of the A and all of that. So I really adored that book.
You know, I think I can sort of say what made me think, oh, I could do this, was Alana by Tamora Pierce. And I know that it made me think that because I hand wrote 150 pages of a fantasy novel that year. I was 10. I don't know what happened to it. I suspect it is mercifully lost to time. But that was a book that I stumbled across in my library, in my public library. It was one of the first books that I was sort of moving out from, like, taking books that were being given, that were coming to me, and reaching out and choosing a book for myself. And I just sort of felt like it was a character that I felt like I could inhabit. And that was also the same year that I read Robin McKinley, The Hero in the Crown and the Blue Sword, that first year, Anne McCaffrey, and I feel like those books, what was wonderful about those books is that I saw myself in the book, you know, and I felt like that was the shift between a lot of the science fiction and the fantasy. You know, Tolkien was my idea of a fantasy novel, and I didn't see myself in it. I didn't notice that I didn't see myself in it at the time. And so I think probably seeing myself in it also told me that I could be the one making it, in a way.
I think my entry was actually fanfic. So I was sitting here thinking about, like, when did I start writing and why? And it was because my group of friends in high school, we had something we called The Note, which was a story that didn't end. We would pass a notebook from one to the other, and we would add on to this long, ongoing story. And the fact that we were doing this big collaborative storytelling thing was really one of the things that made me start writing. The other thing was my mom's an arts administrator. She was until she retired. And I was one of those kids who wanted to do everything. So when I started expressing an interest in writing, she sent me to a writing summer camp. But actually, I don't know if she's in the room. She may be. Irene Voskamp, who's a regular attendee here, if you see her, she and I were basically writing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fanfic. And one of the first things that I remember, that I've, like, one of my first pieces of completed fiction is a Doctor Who Choose Your Own Adventure, which I still have on the accordion paper from dot matrix printers.
Wow.
But I didn't write initially. Like, I mean, I wrote in high school, but then I went off to pursue a career in theater and didn't come back until much later. And there was this moment of, wait a minute, people get paid to do this. I bet I could do that. But I don't remember the moment exactly when that happened, but I do think it was fanfic that led me into writing.
I really can't wait for the opening of the Mary Robinette Kowal Library, because I really want to see that.
I mean, I wasn't good.
Oh, I know. But I want to see the fanfic on the accordion paper that doesn't even end. And yeah. Speaking of fanfic, for me, it wasn't anything I ever thought to write. I grew up in a very small town, and fanfic wasn't a word. And so when I found out about it, I realized, oh, I was mad at Fred Saberhagen for not finishing in my opinion, finishing the Book of Swords. So I just kept going, and I was writing fanfic. Did you guys, aside from what you've already said, what was your intro into fanfic, if you did it at all?
I mean, I didn't know that word growing up.
Yeah.
I didn't have a word for how me and my friends had our elven names and inserted ourselves into the Lord of the Rings plot and made up stories about it. I didn't have one word for that. That was just Sunday.
Oh, it was Saturdays for me.
Yeah, the thing is, I didn't grow up in a geeky family at all. I was raised by extrovert wolves, and they, they're all really into sports, and I didn't get get that. So I did all these things, but I had no connection really to that greater internet world that allows kids these days to know the word for what they're doing. The internet was just a tiny little obnoxious toddler when I was even in junior high. So I guess what we were doing was writing fanfic, but we didn't have anywhere to post it. We didn't understand that that's what it was. We just read Lord of the Rings and didn't see ourselves in it, so we fixed that.
So I used to work as a technical writer, and one of the useful things on my resume was that I can write HTML. The reason I can write HTML is because I taught myself in junior high so that I could properly format my Sailor Moon fanfiction. I didn't know then that it would be a useful life skill that I would get paid for, but I think my parents might have been more supportive of the hours upon hours I spent writing myself into Sailor Moon. Sometimes it was like a self-insert Sailor Jupiter sort of situation, but sometimes that was my own thing. It still exists out there, and where it is will die with me. But I can't think of any books that I wrote fanfic for. I don't think it occurred to me. I think books in my mind were sort of sacred almost. Like this is what it is, and this is how it has to stay. You know, whereas I don't know why Sailor Moon was more fluid, but I'm.
Well, I do think, sorry to the move, often fan fiction is a move between mediums. And it's one of the things that allows us to appreciate the multiplicity of voices. Like if you read a piece of like Tolkien pastiche, where it's someone or Sherlock Holmes pastiche, where it's someone trying to capture the voice of the original works, it's very hard. It's very hard to capture that exact voice. Whereas if you read a piece of fan fiction that's more clearly based on like Sherlock or on the Lord of the Rings movies, then because the voices are making a translation from characters speaking onto the page, I think it's easier for us to sort of let 10,000 different writers have at it.
I think it's also because episodic television, particularly, there's narrative space between the episodes where you can imagine other stories happening. They don't always follow chronologically from the next minute after the previous episode. So, I mean, definitely, the imagination can fill in those gaps, whereas a book is often a book.
Yeah, I had some illusions destroyed where, my husband worked on Haven, and at the end of the season, there was one season where the characters were all like trapped in a burning barn, and somebody, asked him like, well, how do they get out? Like, we haven't been paid to figure that out yet. so all of a sudden you're like, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what happens with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So if you have not read the annotated Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio scripts, you totally need to do this. One of the things that Douglas Adams talks about is that they thought they were going to get canceled at the end of the first season, so they tossed them out of the airlock.
It was the first episode.
First episode. Tossed him out of the airlock. He's like, we'll get to do one episode, and then they're like, we love this, let's have more. And he's like, oh no. Oh no, it would be incredibly improbable if the infinite improbability drive was born. But I think that this kind of interplay is the thing that happens all the time with fiction. For me, my first novel, what I call Novel Zero, which will also never see the light of day, was a combination of my two favorite shows because I was born in 1969 and a child of the 70s and 80s. My two favorite shows, Battlestar Galactica, the original, and A-Team. I was a member of the Dirk Benedict fan club. The new Starbuck I love, but original Starbuck, I still have a thing for. I'm digressing a lot. The point being that it was looking at those interstitial spaces, the oddballs, and like, what can I do in there?
My first novel that I wrote in middle school was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fanfic with the serial numbers filed off, mashed up with David Eddings.
Wow.
It has been destroyed. You will never see it.
I'm sorry, I'm looking up the annotated Hitchhiker's Guide radio scripts right now.
They're so good.
Finding it.
They are so good. You have to buy this thing.
All right, cool. So when we were talking about this panel on email last week, Mary Robinette brought up something very interesting that we should probably be talking about in what I read when I was young, which is there's some things that I'm sure all of us read when we were young that when we look back upon it, not really acceptable type themes for today. And since you brought it up, Mary Robinette, why don't you get us started on that little topic?
So, one of my favorite authors was Piers Anthony. I read him for the puns, and the horses. Let's be clear. I was a teenage girl, and then, as an adult, when I looked at the plot for Spell for Chameleon, I was like, oh my God. Because the plot for Spell for Chameleon is that Chameleon has 3 phases, 3 names also to go with each phase. When she is having her period, she is ugly and really smart, the smartest person you will ever meet. When she is not having her period, she is drop-dead gorgeous and really stupid. Right? And then there's an in-between phase where she's just totally average. And I internalized that, right? I read it and didn't even realize what I was reading. And that just became part of my subconscious landscape.
I loved Piers Anthony too, so I'm not.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I was obsessed with. I actually have never read a Zant's novel. I was obsessed with Incarnations of Immortality and Tarot.
Yeah.
Now, those might be slightly less obvious as to how terrible they are, but they are truly terrible. Tarot has so much pedophilia in it, it's not even funny, and I just didn't get it at the time. In fact, one of the sort of pervasive images of true horror is a voluptuous, curvy woman. And you're supposed to be revolted by the presence of this, like, 30-year-old woman with, like, normal
curves.
Like, she's not, it's not the horror of fatness. That would be another thing. It's just the horror of adultness. And so all of the sexual, like, desire is bent towards these very young female characters. It's extremely disturbing. And Incarnations of Immortality has just all kinds of stuff in it, and ultimately, the character that you are supposed to think is worthy of godhood by the end is the one who has been, the perfect, pure little housewife lady. It's just a mess, all of it is. But I was totally obsessed with the idea of death and earth and fate and all of that.
Oh yeah,
The concept was brilliant. I love
the concept was amazing. I loved it so much.
Yeah.
And the concept of tarot is amazing too.
Here's the thing.
Read a summary on
right.
Wikipedia.
No, but the thing is, I want to say that I do think, right, that it's important not to excuse and not to not see those things and to point them out. But I also think that one of the things is you get cool weirdness by reaching into your id and scraping up like the burnt black bits, like when you're making a sauce or something. And that I think it's really tempting to look either at our own writing or at other writing, especially writing from other periods, and want to cleanse it in a way, and cleanse ourselves in a way, especially when we see the toxic effects of so much of this stuff on our own minds, on the world as a whole. And at the same time, I do think we need to balance that with the recognition that so much of storytelling, and that you can't tell a true story about people without showing ugliness, without there being some ugliness, without there being, and without, in a way, being willing to expose yourself. So I think it's a challenge, and I think that it's and so I want to speak not in defense specifically of those uglinesses, but of ugliness in general, of the problematic in general. And I feel like I often see that it's very hard for us. I see a ton of stuff on Tumblr, for instance, of people being your fave is problematic, and you cancel this show or cancel these people. Getting angry at storytellers also, for instance, because they're telling stories that don't meet what you want and possibly sometimes what you need, and that the problem with it is that you can only, as a writer, my own mantra is you have to write what you can write. And you have to try and tell a true story as much as you can. And if you don't, if you're sort of trying to tell a story that you think is not going to get you yelled at, if you're trying to tell a story that you're afraid is not going to be popular, then in a way, when you're shutting that down, when you're trying to do that it's a real danger that you're also taking out the life in the story as well.
I mean, I think that what you're saying is super valuable, but I do think that there's ids and there's ids. And there is a huge difference between what you're talking about and an author like Piers Anthony, who continually writes books where prepubescent girls are considered valid sexual partners. There is a big difference there.
You had something.
Yeah. Oh, related to that point, the author that I was obsessed with when I was growing up was Jack L. Chalker, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but throughout a very large body of work, a motif that appears over and over again, and for which he has been perhaps rightly mocked for, is he has adult men turned into busty nymphomaniac women over and over. And yes, this is not good trans representation, and it's not, it has problems, but when I was growing up, I am trans, and there were no trans characters in any fiction. So I read Jack L. Chalker because there was nothing else for me. And so even though Jack L. Chalker is not the representation I would give to somebody today, he was there for me when I needed him.
Yeah. I always get nervous talking about this one in public because I feel like I'm rolling the dice on what my inbox is going to look like for the next week. So I'm going to preface this with this. Listen very carefully. I don't hate Dune, okay? I don't. I went hard for Dune in my teens. I think Dune lived in my backpack for about a year and a half. I still have that copy. It's falling to bits. I loved it. I loved it so much. And there's a reason we put that book on a pedestal, right? Because it's great. But Baron Harkonnen is not a character who has aged well. There's nothing redeemable about that character at all. He is ugly inside and out. He is vicious and cruel and violent and just bad. He is also the only character in the book who is not straight, and his homosexuality and his pedophilia and the fact that he is an unrepentant rapist all get lumped into this category of sexual deviancy. If you're a closeted kid growing up Catholic in a conservative community, this is maybe not the best message you could find. Now, was Dune the first place I encountered the idea that all gay people are disgusting pedophiles? No, but that's the problem, is it underlined it for me, right? I read this book when I was 15 years old. I didn't know gay people existed until I was 13. And for those of you who don't know, I'm powerfully gay. So I'm not saying Frank Herbert gave me internalized homophobia. I'm saying it was just part of this drip feed of things I was consuming that were saying, hey, you know these worlds that you think are awesome and that you love and that you want to be part of? They all think you're bad. And so if I were to give Dune to a teenager today, especially a queer teen, I'd be like, there's a lot in this book that's great. Sandworms are dope, but let's talk about that. And let's talk about other things in there too. Let's talk about the sex and gender politics, the literal politics of the Bene Gesserit. Let's talk about what a white savior is, and we can talk about whether or not the book fits that bill. And I think it's important to, all our faves are problematic, right?
Yeah,
There's
right.
no such thing as an unproblematic fave. So I'm not saying cancel Dune. I'm saying read Dune, but do it critically, because I wish I had.
Yeah. I would also say, one of the things that, I've read a lot of books, a lot of that science fiction growing up, a lot of like Asimov's books, and Heinlein and Clarke, and a lot of them, I do think actually that there is a temptation to say, well, it's a product of its time, et cetera. And in fact, I've increasingly gotten to the point where I'm like, well, yes, but that was deliberate. That there was something deliberate and conscious going on. Like, my husband edits Hard Case Crime, which is, they republish often a line of pulp paperbacks. And he routinely has to go through and take out completely gratuitous and completely extraneous racism and sexism and homophobia that clearly were put in there, not because they were important to the story. It almost feels like there was a tick box being done. And I think there was a tick box. And I think that it was a deliberate kind of, push people away. There was a deliberate kind of like, that post-war movement of like push women out of the factories and into the home. And you can see it in the work. And to sort of recognize how there was a larger cultural thing that wasn't just sort of like it was floating in the ether magically, but that there was a conscious, deliberate effort going on in this work, and to recognize it and sort of say it's in all of these for a reason, and that was deliberate.
So one of the things, when we're talking about products of their time and things that they do deliberately, and then I think about the things that I do deliberately, because writing is inherently a political act, right? Because you are making decisions about what to put in, what to leave out. But you're also being influenced by your own unconscious biases, some of which come from the stuff that I read. And Ursula Le Guin, here, I'm going to name drop because this was, I was having tea with Ursula. Because we both lived in Portland, and she didn't really know who I was. But anyway, we were, one of the things that she was talking about, and she's talked about this in other places, is that when she wrote Wizard of Earthsea, she's like, I'm going to do this really subversive thing. I'm going to write this really subversive book, because we never see how young wizards start. And in her day, that was true. So I'm going to write a story about a young wizard. And wizards are always white men. I'm going to write a story about a brown man, and everyone in the book is going to be brown. The villains will be white people from the North. And it wasn't until after she'd written it that she realized, as a staunch feminist, that she had named only one of the female characters in the book, and that was the villain. That none of the other female characters had names. None of them had speaking lines. The aunt that raises Ged, that teaches him magic originally, is the witch and never gets any lines. And she said that she realized that because she had read science fiction and fantasy by men, for men, that was what she was writing. And that's why I think, when for me, it's not about canceling things, but the examining of them critically, right, and realizing the things that I internalized and put into my books. I just finished writing book 3 of the Lady Astronaut series, and there's thank you. Like seriously, like last week. And I'm in the editing process, and there's an art gallery on the moon, and I just realized that I filled it with art only by men. Right? and I did it because I was referencing Apollo astronauts who were all men, and I'm like, fuck it. So I have to go back and rewrite that scene, but this is the kind of unconscious stuff that's going on in our psyche all the time because of the stuff that we read when we were young and the stuff that we continue to read without examining it critically.
when I wrote The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, I think maybe the rest of you have this experience with your first book. You're so nervous about, is it too fill in the blank? Is it too gay? Is it too, whatever? And I was writing it and I was like, are there too many women in this book? Which is a problem no one has had ever. But I was so concerned with, I want to be taken seriously as like a science fiction author, whatever. Are there too many women in this book? And so I went through and counted. There were not too many women in the book. There were less women than men in the book. But there were so many more women than men that I was used to that it felt like too many, which is why with that book and every one after, I go through and I tally all of the background characters and their pronouns, and I will swap until it's 50-50, because that appalls me that was in my head somewhere.
I have a spreadsheet, and I do that I have axes of power. And so I do it for gender, I do it for orientation, race, ability, because I did that as an exercise at some point and realized that I was actually doing okay on gender and race, and that my characters were so cis-het, just like, oh, look at all of those straight people. And I mean, I am straight. There's nothing wrong with being straight, but that was all I was doing because that's what I was reading. And so now I'm working very hard to make sure that people are just there, just allowed to be in my books without being a plot point.
I mean,
Yeah, clap louder. That was good. Yeah.
There's that statistic that, right, they found that 17% of background characters in film are women.
Yeah.
Like just literally walking down the street. If you're seeing people walking down the street, 17%. And if you have more than 17%, then people are like, wait, there's too many women.
I mean, I've been told that there's too many girls in my books many, many times over the years. And most of the time, if you were to go tally it, it's actually 60-40 men, women. But there's that old study about when people perceive that there are women dominating in the room, it's usually around 50-50.
It's 30%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
And the first time I was nominated for Best Novel was for a book called Palimpsest. And in that book, there are 4 protagonists, and they are all bisexual. And that was very much on purpose. I'm bisexual. I very rarely came across bisexuality in anything, ever. As far as books I read when I was young, absolutely zero. But, even when you get into movies and television, Captain Jack is a real anomaly. Even Willow in Buffy, which seemed like having dated a boy and then dated a girl, that would be good bisexual representation, but the show treated her as entirely lesbian as soon as Tara walked on the scene, which I understand. Tara's amazing. But it was so important to me to write this book where everybody was bisexual and it wasn't commented on. It didn't spell their doom. It was just who they were. And unfortunately, when sort of a more mainstream audience got a hold of it when it was nominated for the Hugo, people were really angry about it and talked over and over about how unrealistic it was that 4 unrelated people somewhere on the planet, they're all in different countries with different socioeconomic backgrounds and different lives, would be bisexual.
There can be only one.
We almost fight to the death.
Technically, wouldn't there have to be at least only 2?
I use the same
Or
list.
one very lonely.
Yeah.
I use the same list-making method that Becky does because if left unchecked, I will usually have an imbalance in one direction or the other, and I use that to get a more or less 50-50 when I wrote Nine Fox Gambit, and then I went on the internet and I learned that there were non-binary people, and it was very difficult to go back and edit the book to add non-binary people because basically I killed my copy editors doing that in book 2. Because once I think of a character as, for example, she, her, if I change the pronouns, my brain thinks of both sets of pronouns as being correct, and I'm unable to correct it. But I had a choice moving forward. I said, I can either continue with 50-50, like, male and female characters, or I can start adding non-binary characters to the mix. And this is going to be It's not going to be great world-building continuity, but fuck continuity. Because I have non-binary friends, and they deserve to see themselves in books, too.
Yeah.
Well, I think it says a tremendous amount about how things have changed in the last 10 years, that space opera has a non-binary protagonist. And it's practically the first thing that's said about him, and it's discussed frequently. There are people who just say there's a dude protagonist because I guess they don't read for comprehension. But no one has made a big deal about it in any way. I have not been harassed over it the way I was with Palimpsest. It has been just a thing that is part of the book, and that fills me with hope for the future, by God. But it's interesting that in just 10 years, we've gone from bisexuality being pearl clutching on the Hugo ballot to non-binary people all over the place in the Hugo ballot, and it's not considered a problem.
As it should be.
Yes, as it should be.
Well, this is awesome, and I'm sure we would love to sit here and have you guys talk about this all day, but it's my job to actually keep us on topic, and we're running out of time. So what I want to do right now is ask you guys to name a book from your childhood that you would recommend to a kid or teen today. You can go last, Jude, if you want.
Tombs of Atuan by Ursula Le Guin. I would hesitate on Wizard of Earthsea without prefacing some of that, but the sequel can be read as a standalone. And it is a strong young woman who is dealing with cultural indoctrination and fighting it, and dealing with being put into a box and fighting that. And I did a reread of it recently, and it holds up, and I would recommend that one today.
I have a very clear thing because I've been trying to get my child to read the Dark is Rising series by Susan Cooper, and because, of course, I have recommended it, it is of no interest whatsoever. But one day she'll open it, and then she'll see that I was right.
Tell her she can't read it.
Talk about a Susan Cooper book as well, actually. So Dark is Rising is what people know her for, but my favorite book of Susan Cooper's is called Seaward. It is, yay! One Seaward fan. It actually holds up extraordinarily well. And I don't want to talk too much about what it's about because it's all full of spoilers, but it is a portal fantasy. It's a boy and girl protagonist. The boy is a South American refugee, and the girl is a neglected English child, and it's an incredible book that I read at 8 and I read at 22, and I have read out loud to multiple people because I love it so much, and I would highly recommend it.
I didn't know about that book. I'm like,
It's so good. It's because it keeps going in and out of print because it's a standalone, not a series, and yeah, but it's really, really good. Find it.
So I'm going to say this, but I haven't actually read it since I was a kid, so I don't know. Wrinkle in Time, though.
Oh, yeah.
Was that, I loved that book so much when I was a kid. I wanted to curl up in that book, and I remember Meg as being a wonderful protagonist for me to read as a young girl. So I would, sorry? What? No? Well, okay, like I said, haven't read it since I was a kid, but Yoon.
I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian. I'm told I really loved this book when I was a child. It's a bit light on plot, and they might be hard to find these days, the telephone book.
Oh, yeah.
No, I mean literally a telephone book, because you learn so much about what kinds of... No, I am dead serious. You learn so much about what kinds of people live in your community, who is there, what the demographics are of... Baton Rouge, where I live, has a large Vietnamese community. Never would have guessed. There's more variety in people in wherever you live than you would necessarily think.
Huh.
I have one rotting on my front porch.
I have one propping up, no. They don't actually even deliver them anymore. But I think not to, anyway, I'm like, I know adults who should read the telephone book with that.
Yes. We have a little bit of time for questions. It's a little hard to see you guys, but if you have a question in the back, stand up and speak loudly, please, or come up here if you need to.
We have a microphone. Hang on.
Oh, great. I was wondering about that.
You all mentioned book that you liked as a kid. Do you have any book that you disliked as a kid, but when you look back or reread them, you find out, oh yeah, that was actually good?
The Hobbit. No, I found The Hobbit very hard to relate to because it had all these European landscapes. I was living in Texas and South Korea, so it was nothing like what I was used to. And there were no women, which I was not out at the time, and I have a little sister. So yeah, I found The Hobbit very, very hard to read and did not like it as a child. I must now resign from science fiction.
It's now your inbox that's toast. I can't remember any. I liked everything.
I don't reread things I dislike, so.
Left Hand of Darkness. I was way too young when I read it because I was reading everything that Ursula Le Guin wrote, and it's fantastic, but I was just too young to get it.
I also can't think of something that I remember rereading later on that I liked. Well, actually, no. You know what? The Rex Stout books. Because I, like my own child now, so I am reaping my own sins, would not read anything that my parents recommended to me after a certain age. And my parents were like, the Nero Wolfe books are so great. And I was like, nah. And then one day I think I was sick and I'd read everything else at home and I finally picked them up. And I mean, but that's like between when I was, like 10 and when I was 15. So that's the last one.
Yeah, well, when you say too young to read, I feel like this is such a common experience, but it's the other way around with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings for me. Read The Hobbit when I was very young. Was like, ooh, there's sequels. This will be great. And then Lord of the Rings is upsetting and dark and written very differently, and what happened to my beautiful little Hobbit friends, and I didn't like it at all, but then I picked it up as a teenager and loved it to pieces.
See, actually, that gives me my answer. The Silmarillion. I tried when I was 10. That didn't work out so well.
Do we have another question? In front?
Hang on.
Hang on.
You were talking about problematic favorites. What do you think would be looked upon as problematic in the future of writing today, or perhaps even your own novels?
Everything.
I have only had one coffee, sir.
So I can tell you about something that I totally screwed up on. Shades of Milk and Honey, which is my first novel, is all white people all the time, and I justified that because it was set. I thought I was doing the right thing because it's Jane Austen fanfic. Let's be clear, and in Regency, England, I thought it's a small town in the Regency. There are no black people there, and I'm dead wrong, completely 100% wrong. There were black Roman legionaries in Scotland. If you look at the birth records and the church registries, there are black people all through England. There were, and then my second book is set in Brussels, and I'm like, oh, still, there's no black people. I'm like, no, Peter Bruegel was drawing black people in the 1500s. They were there, and I just regurgitated what I had seen, and that is a mistake. If I could rewrite that, I would.
All my early short fiction was about white people in Western cultures, because the science fiction and fantasy I had read growing up was about white people in Western cultures. And then I realized, wait a second, there's more than that in the world.
If I could go back, I would write the character of Corbin in The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet differently, or at least a little more carefully. Corbin is intended to be an antisocial asshole. He's based on someone I used to work with.
My villain is too.
But I've had some readers who interpret him as autistic. And I did not intend that, but I see why. And why that interpretation is out there. And so if I could go back, I would just clean up a few things with him to make it very clear that it's not about him being neuroatypical, it's about him being a jerk.
As far as my own work goes, I don't know. I'm sure I've screwed up tons. I try to forget things I write almost as soon as I write them, so I can't speak to that. But I do want to talk a little bit about what you said, like what might be considered problematic in the future. You know, the idea that everything we're talking about as problematic is somehow in the far past of our childhoods, and everything that's being written now is super woke, is wrong.
Yeah.
Epic fantasy still has the same problems it's always had and looks very little different from the epic fantasy of the past. And, you know, it just is going to be that way for a while. How long that while is, I don't know. So I think people are going to look back on our time and see some books that give them representation and a lot of books that don't. Same as most people look back on the past. We just, unfortunately, all grew up during a time when there was practically zero representation. So it might look a little better, but there are whole subgenres that aren't even making an attempt to self-reflect the way we are up here, that aren't even trying for the level of representation, who would never say, oh, I wish that I had researched a little bit more with one of my books and I would write it differently now. You know, the most popular TV show in the world, Game of Thrones, still has some serious race issues, and that's kind of baked into not the subject matter of the genre, but the assumptions of that subgenre. So it's not all Tumblr as far as the eye can see out here, and so I think that the same things will probably be problematic in 20 years that are problematic now. It's just that wokeness is not evenly distributed, much like the future.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that, you know, in many ways, I'm sorry, I'm going to be like a giant downer and bring politics into this, that I do think that, you know, 2016 and beyond has been a wake-up call for many of us who wanted and or want to believe that that we're on a steady progress. And the thing is that, you know, all forms of exploitation are somebody benefits, right? Somebody wins, and therefore somebody loses. That's the reason behind a lot of you know, the isms, that they're designed to help to be excuses for people to look at the suffering of other people and their own comfort. And say that their comfort comes before the terrible suffering of others. And I think that, you know, I try in my darker moments of the night to tell myself that it's better to see and to see the problem more clearly and to be confronting it and to be looking at it, and that we all, you know, without losing joy in our lives, in our daily lives, and that storytelling is important, and telling good stories is important, and giving people things that make them stories that people can both live in and that make them want to write, and hope that we are kind of sending a good word into the future, and to our own children. And yeah, I don't know. That's all I got. Sorry.
Well, unfortunately, with that, we have to stop. But thank you guys so much for coming out, and thank you to my awesome panelists.